Welcome to episode 4 of our 5 Themes of Geography video series. This one's all about human-environment interaction. And the basic question for this is, what is the relationship between humans and their environment? So there's really 3 things we take into account when discussing this. How do humans depend upon the environment? So in other words, what do they need from the environment around them to survive? How do humans modify the environment, which means what changes do they make to the environment? And then how do they adapt to their environments? In other words, what changes do they make for themselves? So we're going to show kind of old examples and then new examples of how humans have depended on the environment for thousands of years. And we'll start with Native Americans. And this one shows a Native American hunting party. And this is one way that humans have depended on the environment for as long as there have been humans. And that's for food. So they have their horses, which also come from nature, so they kind of depend upon that. But you can see the spears, and they're probably following a pack of buffalo, and they're depending upon the environment around them to feed them, to keep them alive. Now, they would also need a fresh water source, so they're probably near rivers or lakes. So that's one way that humans have definitely always needed the environment around them to survive. They would also use parts of the buffalo for shelter, and that's another way that humans have depended upon the environment, to have something over their heads to keep them safe from the elements, whether it was weather or wild animals or whatever. You can see here some teepees that were probably made from buffalo skin. Some Native American tribes actually carved out houses in the sides of cliffs. You can find these are in Colorado, and they actually lived inside the cliffs, so they actually used that for shelter. And then the ones you guys talked about a lot last year would have been the tribe like the Powhatan or the Iroquois, who were going to use wood and wood shavings and sometimes animal skins to build what's called a longhouse, and that was going to keep them safe in harsh weather, whether it's really, really hot or really, really cold. And here's a diagram that's, you can see, is from the South Dakota State Historical Society. I usually call the buffalo Walmart for Native Americans, because the buffalo provided everything, just like Walmart has everything we need now. So if you look, the tanned hide, which means the skin that has been treated a little bit, was used to make moccasins and cradles, robes, other kinds of clothes, and dolls and things like that for the kids. The rawhide, which just means just the skin by itself, was used for buckets and shields and the bottoms of shoes and medicine bags and all sorts of stuff like that. They would use the horns for basically their plates and cups and things like that. It looks gross, but the brains inside the buffalo, they would rub them onto the hide to be able to bend them a little bit easier and change them into different things. They would use the skull of the buffalo in their religious ceremonies. They ate the tongue. The tongue apparently was the best part, so if you were a Native American child, you couldn't wait to eat the buffalo tongue. And then other things, even like just the hair and the beard, was used for some of their clothes and ornaments and stuff like that. They, of course, ate all the other meat as well. But basically, everything that they needed was going to come from the buffalo. And that's an example of humans relying on the environment to survive. Not a whole lot has changed, like when we take that into consideration. The environment is still where we grow a lot of our crops. Farming is huge to keep people alive. That's where our food comes, or the vast majority of our food comes, and that's nature helping us out once again. The framing of our houses, no matter how big our house is, even if we don't live in a log cabin, which most of us don't, there's still a ton of wood that's used in the framing of our homes, and that comes from nature. And then the cotton and the wool that comes from sheep are going to be turned into cloth, and that's where a lot of our clothes come from. And even if our clothes are like polyester or something that's a fiber that's made from chemicals and that sort of thing, those chemicals actually come from petroleum, which comes from nature. So for shelter and for food and for clothing, we still rely on nature today. Usually what we talk about with human-environment interaction is how people modify or change the environment around them. And those are the most obvious examples. So even with farmers' fields, and there's an aerial photograph of farms, even though it looks very natural in terms of having a lot of plant life and trees and stuff like that, that land has been changed. That land was turned over many times by plows. Crops were planted. You can see the fields are perfect rectangles that doesn't happen in nature ordinarily. And you can see some buildings and stuff that are built there as well. Those are all changes that humans have made to the environment. This is Tokyo. I want you to look at Tokyo now. I want you to think to yourself what Tokyo might have looked like 1,000 years ago, or better yet, 2,000 years ago, or better yet, 2 million years ago, and try to think how people have changed the environment of what is now Tokyo. There's also about 35 million people who live in Tokyo and around Tokyo, with lots and lots and lots of changes to the environment. And this is a mine in Minnesota. It's an old photograph. It's from about 80 years ago from a place called Mesabi, which is up in the northern parts of Minnesota. And they're mining for coal. They're mining for other iron ore and stuff like that. And they're going into mountains and they're digging into the sides of mountains. And that, of course, is changing the mountain. That would not have happened naturally. So they're pulling resources from the earth. Luckstone does this as well when they do their blasts, which we'll see in a couple of months. But this is another example of humans modifying or changing the environment around them. Some of the most obvious examples that we have of human-environment interaction involve pollution. If you throw something on the ground instead of in a trash can, if you just put something into a landfill instead of recycling it, that's all changing the environment. And if you're looking at this picture and thinking to yourself, wow, it looks like that water is on fire, but that's impossible, well, usually it's impossible unless you've dumped so many chemicals into the water that the chemicals actually go up in flames and the river goes up in flames with it. And this is actually the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. And yes, the river is burning. And that's an extreme example of people changing the environment. There were so many chemicals that had been dumped in the river to get rid of them that a spark on a really hot day hit the river and it actually burned. And believe it or not, this was not the first time that it happened. So pollution is really an extreme example of human-environment interaction and the negative impact that people can have on the environment around them. If you want to read a good book about human-environment interaction, I would recommend The Lorax by Dr. Seuss, which is actually, even though it is a Dr. Seuss book, it's all about the impact that people, or in this case, fuzzy little orange guys with giant yellow bushy mustaches can have in the environment. And also the Onceler, if you're familiar with the book, who is a kind of scary looking green guy, has a real negative impact on the environment. The Lorax is trying to protect the environment. And it's a good example of human environment interaction from our good buddy, Dr. Seuss. And I'm going to return to Rand McNally World Atlas to show our next aspect of human-environment interaction. So if I click on the layers, I'm going to go to climate this time. And this one is going to give us some ideas of some different types of climates. You have tropical, you have dry, you have mild, humid, severe, polar. And if you look at the United States, this area down here is kind of that desert. We see dry, semi-arid, or dry arid. Arid is a fancy word for dry. So these areas have to do something that other parts of the country don't necessarily have to do all that often. Occasionally in Virginia we'll have a period of time where there's not a lot of rain, and if it's a really long time, they'll tell us that we have to kind of cut down on how much water we're using. They'll say, please don't water your grass, or, take shorter showers if possible. People in Arizona and New Mexico, they live like that all the time. So what they need to be sure to do is they need to conserve or save water. So in this case, what this person has done, and you can see your partner in conserving desert waters on the sign right about there, they're advertising the fact that they got rid of the grass in their house. And you can look closely, you can see it's just rocks. Rocks, of course, don't need to be watered. So all that water that would have been used to water the lawn or water the grass is now being saved for more important things like showering, drinking water, and that sort of thing that people need to survive. They do have some little plants there just to decorate just a little bit, but that's an example of water conservation. I'm going to go back to the Rand McNally World Atlas for just a second. I'm going to change layers. I'm going to come over here again under environment. I'm going to take my climate one off, and I'm going to show average temperatures for July. Let's see what this is here. So You can see the red would be the hottest temperatures. This is average temperatures over 95 degrees. Since it's July, most of the country is in that 59 to 68, 68 to 77. So the southern parts of the country are going to be around here, 77 to 86, 86 to 95. Those areas that are in those hotter temperatures, and we see here, that's in the over 95 degree belt. One really important adaptation that those people have to make is that they have to have air conditioning in pretty much every building that they have, whether it's their homes, their schools, their businesses. There are parts of the country, and this might be hard for some of us to believe, that the schools don't have air conditioning. Where I grew up in New York, older schools, we didn't have air conditioners in our schools. We had windows that opened, but we didn't have air conditioners in our schools. In Virginia, even though we're kind of in the same climate zone as New York, we tend to be a bit hotter than New York. Plus, a lot of our schools are newer, and we have air conditioning, thankfully, because when we go back to school in August, it tends to be really hot. People in Georgia and Florida, Texas, these states down here, and especially out in the Southwest, they really need to have air conditioning because it's really not safe in those hot summer months without it. If I change the layer, and now let's look at January, average January temperatures, you probably don't have a lot of places that have heating systems in their schools and buildings. They probably have them in their homes, but down in the southern parts of the country, in those southwestern areas, because even in January, which is usually the coldest month of the year, they're still averaging between 50 and 60 degrees, in some cases a little bit higher. The further north you go, you have to make a lot of adaptations, and heat is extraordinarily important, especially if you're looking in Minnesota. We're looking up where I just was talking about New York and in Maine, the Dakotas and Montana. They have heat in every building they're going to be going into. In some cases, their homes have regular heat like we have in our houses, but they would also have like wood burning stoves in case they lose power, because they also get a lot of snow. An interesting adaptation that you might see, and I'm going to switch over to precipitation for the winter. Let's take the temperatures off. In the really snowy areas of the country, which would be right around here on the Great Lakes area, you look at Chicago, you look at parts of Wisconsin, where you're looking at, on average, 10 to 20 inches of precipitation in the form of snow, which that actually, if it's snow, you actually have to multiply it by about 10. So if a place averages about 10 inches of precipitation in the winter, that's like averaging 100 inches of snow. About 1 inch of rain is going to equal about 10 inches of snow. So just picture that, and picture some of the storms we've had. Now, that doesn't mean it's all snow, but if you look at a place like here in the central part of New York where it's pretty cold, that's in the 40 to 80 inch range. And there are some cities in New York that yearly get about 200 to 300 inches of snow per year, which we can hardly fathom down here in Virginia. A lot of our precipitation, even in January, is still snow, is still rain. So to do that, they've had to make a pretty interesting adaptation to some of their homes. So this looks like either a construction project that went horribly wrong, or somebody forgot a very important detail to this house. We see a door here. We also see a door here, and it looks like that'd be extraordinarily dangerous if you open that door and decide to exit the house that way, because you'd fall about 6 feet. Well, the reason why this house has a door like that, and a lot of houses in those snowy regions have doors like that, is because the snow oftentimes will cover the entire front door. So they have a second door that they can open up and very carefully exit their house if they need to, in case of an emergency, or in case they need to try to dig themselves out. Usually a good place to start would be right in front of the second door, because you have to wait for a lot of the snow to melt before you can get at that first one. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we don't really have to worry about very much in Virginia, even with our 3 or 4 foot storms we've had the last couple of years. But in certain parts of the country, that is an adaptation that they have had to make. So that's the end of episode 4 on human environment interaction. Episode 5 is going to be all about the theme of movement and how we get around the country, how we have gotten around the country in the past, and also the very important question of why are we moving around the country. We'll see you then.